Hi, this is John Willoughby, back again with part 4 of our cryptocurrency dashboard app. In part 1, we covered the design of our app, and here it is again for your reference. We have a section to select our base currency, a grid to display the current prices, a chart to show the price history of a selected base alt currency pair, and a date time picker and a set of buttons to select the time period to show in the chart. In part 2, we set up the basic structure of the app, and in part 3, we hooked up our data source. Here's what it looks like so far. We have all the controls set up, but we're missing the actual data displays, the grid in the chart. So it's time to do the fun stuff, starting in this section with the grid. The grid is a component that displays data in a tabular format. For our dashboard, we'll create 3 grids, one for each tab. The grid will allow us to see data for a list of currencies in a particular market. First, we'll create a function to set the data source, and then we'll create a function to set the grid's options. Next, we'll initialize the 3 grid components, and lastly, we'll refactor some of the code. Note that having 3 grids was a design decision, and another option would be to create 1 grid and reload it with new data each time a different base currency is selected. The first approach adds some more time up front to load up the 3 grids with their data, and the second option speeds up front time, but at the expense of needing to reload the grid data each time a new base currency is selected. The current method seems like a good choice if you want to switch between base currencies, but what if it turns out that our users only ever pick one base currency to look at? That's a good example of how important it is to understand what the actual use case is, because you will often need to make design decisions that factor in those objectives. The configuration options for each grid are also the same except for one option. They each require a different data source. So we'll create a function that accepts a Kendo data source instance as a parameter and sets the data source option of the grid to this value. This way, when we initialize our components, we don't have to rewrite the same code over again, and the component will be more readable because its arguments will be reduced to one variable. And notice here that we've taken advantage of the template capabilities in the market column to control how the data is displayed. Now we have a way of setting the data source and the options for our grid. We can begin to initialize each component. First, we'll call getDataSource with the appropriate URL and save it to a variable. And then we'll call getGridOptions with a reference to getDataSource as an argument and store it in a variable. Here we've done that once for each grid. Next, we'll replace the content of the tab strip with div elements. Each div will be given an ID that will be used to initialize the components for that grid. And finally, we'll initialize each of the grids by adding the following code. And we hit Control-Enter to run this and cross our fingers, and yes, there we see our grids. And let's make this a little wider here. Okay. And note that it might take a few seconds to load the data when you start this up. Now that our grid works, we need to make some changes so that it looks better. Currently, the height of the grid is much too short for the amount of data we need to load. We'd like to see more of the data on the screen. The grid should also be more interactive. At the moment, it doesn't do anything particularly dynamic. In order to change the height of the grid, we'll increase the height of the splitter component. So we're going to add in some CSS to control it. To make the grid more interactive, we'll add the sortable and selectable options to the grid. Making the grid sortable will allow users to click on the grid's header and sort the data by each column. Making the grid selectable will highlight the selected row. It will also help us to identify the selected data item. And we're going to need this information later so we can create our chart. So here we've added selectable true, and here we've added sortable true. These are just 2 of the many options available for the Kendo UI Grid. And we really have a huge amount of control over exactly how the grid looks and behaves. But we'll just use these 2 features for now. Note that the data from the API updates every 10 to 15 minutes, and something else we could do is either add a button to fetch new data, or just go out periodically and update the data automatically. You might also want to add a progress bar to show that the data is loading, since it doesn't always happen immediately, but we'll leave that exercise to the viewer. In the next section, we're going to move on to the other main component, the chart. See you soon!